So I've been talking about this notion that the artist, no matter where or when they might live, again, from most modern times all the way back to earliest times, the very dawn of human culture, what they've been doing is communing with the dead. And it's precisely for this reason that Eliot starts to say some of the things that either students don't understand or don't agree with. And that's about this process of continuous surrender, of self-sacrifice, or of the extinction of personality through which the poet must go. Yeah, if you're going to become the speaker for the dead, you have to do what? You've got to surrender your own ego so much so that you become a vessel that the dead can occupy or possess. When you write, it's not your voice or your experiences or your feelings that come out. It's theirs. It's theirs. And so there is this very strong resistance to the idea that poetry is somehow about self-expression. Yeah, it's about expression, but it's not about self-expression. It's about expression of the other. And to the extent that you maintain prisoner to your own ego, prisoner to your own personality, the dead can't use you. So here we have again this idea of the annihilation of self. Speaking of technology, which I mentioned earlier, this is something which would have been very interesting to Eliot in his own day, because as we approach modernity, we're starting to see new kinds of technology arise which make it increasingly easy for us to access the souls of the dead. These would be inventions of the 19th century, but still, again, relatively new in Eliot's day, such as the phonograph, which can record somebody's voice, the photograph, which can record their face. And it's these particular technologies which, in modern times, we use to summon up the spirits of the ancestors. So one of the books which Eliot would have found very, very interesting would have been a novel which you probably haven't read, but you know, and that's Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you ever do get around to reading that, one of the things you'll notice is, yeah, there's vampires and stuff in there, but that's really not the main focus of the novel. The novel's primarily interested in photography and the phonograph. Why? Because these are ways that we have come up with in relatively recent times to keep the souls of the dead around us and to summon them up almost on command. So Dracula is just using the vampire and the undead as analogous means through which he can explore what really interests him, and that's going to be this supernatural powers contained in the most modern technologies. And you could say, well, they didn't really believe in ghosts. Yeah, they did. If you go back and look at the late 19th century, seances were hugely popular, as were ghost rappings and table turning and Ouija boards and all kinds of stuff like that. They were absolutely fascinated with communicating with the dead, though Eliot's contention is that if we're really going to do it in a way which isn't just mummery or trickery or self-deception, it's going to be through poetry. And you'll say, wow, if this is really what Eliot's all about, then Dracula must be the greatest novel of the 19th century, and Eliot would have loved it. And my contention is no. Well, why not? Because what Stoker is doing in Dracula is writing about the supernatural powers contained in modern technologies, but he's doing it through the writing which we would call 19th century realism. So he's writing about how haunted modern life is, but he's doing it using all of the conventional literary devices of previous generations. He's talking about technology from outside of technology, or he's talking about the newest technologies from outside of the newest technologies. So he's come close, but he's not there yet. What Eliot makes his project, though, and this is why he would think he was a better writer than Bram Stoker, because Eliot's talking about technologies from within the technologies. So if you look at Eliot's not first poem, but his greatest poem, it's called The Wasteland. And what is that? What does it look like? Well, if you ever read it, and I'll put some excerpts of it on the blog for you to see, you know, there's voices drifting all over the place. You can't tell who's speaking. It doesn't seem like there's even what we call a persona. You know, it doesn't seem like there's really a speaker to the poem at all. And why is this? Because Eliot is trying to write about modern times through the medium of radio. If you can picture somebody listening to the radio in 1919 in a dark room late at night, you know, you dial in, you know, with your tube radio, signals coming from all parts of the country and the globe, from different people, sometimes in different languages, and they're all coming out of a single box. And so Eliot is actually, he's not writing about the radio, he's writing poetry as if it were being heard over the radio. And I would suggest that the best way to appreciate this poem is not even to read it out of a book, but to actually listen to it read over the radio. You can see the difference. But Dracula writing about technologies, but not from within those technologies, and Eliot in The Wasteland leaping right into the technologies that he wants to explore and writing in such a way that he's processing his language through the conventions that we associate with the new medium. He's writing about the technology from within the technology. And one of the interesting things about the radio is it does what? It depersonalizes us. There's no one speaker on the radio, but there's all kinds of voices interacting with one another. And it's the job of the poet to be able to leap from this voice to that voice to the next voice, none of which are himself, whereas Wordsworth wants the poet to speak only as himself and in his own voice in a language that represents him. Eliot is not interested in that kind of sincerity or earnestness. He's interested in irony. The poet never speaks for himself. He's only speaking for other people. He's the puppet, or he's the puppet through which they communicate, or he's the radio, if you want to put it that way. You know, you can't speak for yourself. You have to be the instrument through which others speak. So this is why this irony becomes the new mood permeating all of Eliot's poetry. Why sincerity has to go. Why it's hard to tell who's speaking, and why it's hard to tell what Eliot actually thinks, because he's not speaking. He's merely a conduit. And if you don't believe me, or if you just want to get a little bit more of an example on this, Eliot, you know, for all of the for all that he was a powerful writer, he had an awful lot of help from other people. One of whom was a fellow poet and critic, Ezra Pound. And one of the things that Pound actually did was name the Wasteland. So Eliot originally was going to call it "He Do the Police in Different Voices." That's a weird name for a poem. Why would you call it that? Well, it's actually a quotation from a Charles Dickens novel called Our Mutual Friend. The opening scene, there's a father and daughter, impoverished, living in some London slum, and what they do to make a living is drag the Thames River for dead bodies. And whenever they dig up a body, they're going to comb it for any valuables on it and then just throw it back into the river. But it's all about poverty and debt, as so much of Dickens is. And one of the characters ends up in debtor's prison, as you may have heard of. You can't pay your bills, so we're going to throw you in jail until your family will bail you out. Well, wherever there's a prison, there's going to be prison guards, and a lot of them have to keep the graveyard shift. And so two guys working the door of this prison have to keep themselves awake all night long by doing. Now, in Dickens' world, there's no radio, there's no TV to keep you, there's no Spotify. So how are you going to keep yourself awake? You're going to read the newspaper, and there's a character in there whose name is Sloppy, for whatever it's worth. But what he does to keep himself and everybody awake at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning is he reads the police blotter. Now, you guys won't know what the police blotter is, maybe, because nobody even reads a print newspaper anymore, but it's a page or two in old print newspapers that were dedicated to different calls or assignments that the police had been given in the last 24 hours. So, if you actually read the Utah Daily Chronicle, the way people used to 10 years ago, there was actually a police blotter in there. So they would say, this person was caught shoplifting from the bookstore, 8 bicycles were stolen out in front of the Marriott Library, this person had to be removed from campus for illegal possession of a firearm, this other person, who knows what, hacked into the university's server and started changing their own grades. And why do they call it the blotter? Because there's a dispatcher listening on the telephone, and they're going to do what? Write down on a piece of paper who placed the call, what the problem is, and then they can call a cop and send them out there. So you print this police blotter up in the newspaper, and for kicks, people read it. But these guys are trying to stay awake during the graveyard shift again. Graveyard shift, interesting. Anyway, and what do? They read it aloud, but Sloppy, the character, does what? He doesn't simply convey the message in the police blotter stories in his own voice, but he acts them out as if he were the person who had committed the crime. And so the comment made about him is, he do the police in different voices. He reads the police blotter in different voices. But again, this is what Eliot's got in mind for his poem, The Wasteland. He's not speaking for himself. He's speaking for people hither and yon. And he is, again, as I've been saying, he's merely the vehicle through which the dead speak. But he's not using a newspaper as his dominant medium that he's reflecting on. I think it's the radio. So he calls his poem originally, He Do the Police in Different Voices. And eventually it will get renamed by his colleague Ezra Pound, The Wasteland. But when you start to read the poem, what's the wasteland all about? The first line is about a dog sniffing at the grave of his former owner and trying to establish some contact with the dead guy. I think this is so interesting because if you know anything about vinyl, old phonograph records, RCA was one of the big recording companies, and what was their mascot or their logo? It was a little dog. I think his name was Nipper or something like that. You may have seen this, but he's sitting in front of a gramophone, and his ears are all pricked, and it says his master's voice. So it's kind of a poignant image, but the master's dead, and yet the dog continues to think he's alive because he can hear the master's voice coming out of the gramophone. So this idea of communion with the dead is in the RCA logo. It's tied to sound recording, and this is the very first image that Eliot uses in his poetry. And once he goes from that, there's a whole other section in the Wasteland about one Madame Sosostra, who's a clairvoyant. What does that mean? She's somebody who has seances, and she acts as a medium, an intermediary between the living customer of hers and the dead family member that the clairvoyant is going to try to speak for. So this idea of technology and clairvoyancy and necromancy is the proper term. Necromancy is the magical act of conjuring up the spirits of the dead and communing with them. This is what Eliot's The Wasteland is all about. You'll notice if you look at it that the earlier author whom he seems most closely to be emulating, or who seems, if you want to see things magically and from Eliot's perspective, who seems most to be possessing him and speaking through him is Dante. And of course, Dante's famous poem is the Inferno. It's all about what? It's all about journeys through the land of the dead. So that's what's going on in the Wasteland. I think it's absolutely fascinating. We'll move on to the next section of the poem, of the essay, because this video is getting long. I always say I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet, and it's impossible for me. One, because I'm blabby, but two, because these things are really complex and very interesting and worth exploring. So, even if you're not a fan of poetry, how could it not be fascinating to you to think that the Nobel-winning poet who established what art would look like for the next, or for the rest of the century, is actually offering in one of his most famous statements a declaration that if art is going to remain relevant in modern times, it must be tied with archaic magic, and in particular necromancy. That's interesting. So anyway, depersonalization is going to be absolutely essential for the artist to become a mouthpiece for the dead. And one of the other things that will... I set an alarm so that I don't make these videos too long. I'm going to give it another few minutes. Another thing that this depersonalization is going to do is take all of the emphasis and interest off of the speaker, and it's going to place it on the poetry. And this will give us the opportunity to do what? To judge whether poems are good for objective reasons. And that's why Eliot brings in the metaphor of the synthesis of sulfuric acid. You take sulfur dioxide, you take oxygen, and you put in a platinum filament. That's the catalyst. And not because you just want that to be the case, but for objective reasons, which we can scientifically prove. When these things come into contact with one another, you will get this yield, right? And it has nothing to do with who's conducting the experiment or who's starting the reaction. It could be a man, it could be a woman, it could be a child, it could be person from this race, from that religion, of this origin. It doesn't matter. In every instance, for objective reasons, this reaction will take place. And Eliot's going to say that in poetry, it's the same way. People have been misunderstanding and improperly evaluating the worth of different poems because they see the poem principally as a reflection of the author. And he's like, no, no, no. If a poem is going to be good, it's got to be good for reasons that are entirely contained within the text of the poem, and all external considerations, which is to say, history,
as well as biography.
That's a matter of irrelevance. Oh, and the term he'll use for that is blue book knowledge. What's blue book? Blue book is the thing that you used to buy before there was a Lonely Planet, or Rick Steves was telling you, well, this little village in Italy, it dates back to the 15th century. All of that background information is what you need to lose. And if you can't read a poem and get something out of it without having all of those footnotes and that travel guide, that blue book, to escort you through the various references, then yeah, that poem might be of special interest to somebody who's writing a doctoral dissertation, but to the average reader, it's going to make no sense. And so it's not going to become part of the tradition. Now, this is really interesting because one of the people that Eliot's known to have been buds with is one of the first great modern novelists, Virginia Woolf. And we know her for her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse, and The Waves, and all of that. But she wrote letters, and she wrote a diary, and she wrote literary criticism too. One of the books she writes is The Common Reader. I picked this up when I went to France. I needed something to read by the beach or by the pool. So I took Virginia Woolf's The Common Reader, having no idea what it was about. And when I actually cracked it and started to read it, I was kind of amazed. I mean, it wasn't the most exciting book I'd ever seen, but it was quite fascinating in that what was Woolf trying to do? She was trying to say, what out of English literature, for as long as there's been modern English literature, could the typical person, which is to say the common reader, somebody who's not writing a doctoral dissertation, somebody who doesn't have a PhD in history from Harvard, somebody who doesn't have access to footnotes galore, what could they pick up and actually sit down and think this was a great read? I got into this book and it was enjoyable. And she's going to begin to do what? Going all the way back to the late Middle Ages, up into her own time, she's going to name all of the great books which anybody like you and me who doesn't have any special knowledge could just pick up as, we were waiting to have our tooth drilled in the dentist office and just consider to be a good read. I think it's really interesting that she includes as a standard work that everybody ought to know is somebody named Jane Austen. I mean, Jane Austen sold a lot of books prior to this, and a lot of people liked her, but it was considered light fare, maybe a harmless pastime, maybe a waste of time, but nobody ever thought of her as a great writer until Virginia Woolf comes along. And using the sensibilities of T.S. Eliot, as well as his determination to separate what is of historical interest or of special interest from what is of general interest, she's including Jane Austen now in the literary canon. Why? Because of her wit, which we'll get to in a little bit. And if you've read Jane Austen, you know that she's got an amazing dry sense of humor, but also she's got amazing control over language. And if she has any fault at all, according to Virginia Woolf, it may simply be that her characters feel a little bit too much like marionettes. And although they can make us laugh, they don't move our hearts as powerfully as earlier or later writers. But, why is this the case? Because Jane Austen wasn't trained to write the way that men were trained to write, and also because she died quite early. She died quite young. And if you go back and look at the novels, There is a progress that she makes in them, and by the time she gets around to writing her last novel, Persuasion, this whole new emotional depth has come into not just the narration, but into the characters. And Woolf's contention is, had she lived longer, she would have gone on to be as great as anybody. Anywho, then he's going to make another one of these distinctions that could be confusing to us. The next one will be between emotions and feelings. Well, don't those mean this? No, they don't, at least not in Eliot. What's the difference between the two? Emotions are the type of affective states that anybody can have and that are the stuff of everyday life. So I burnt my egg today and I'm disappointed because I don't have any more to cook. I haven't been out shopping. Or I used to date somebody and now I see her driving the car with another person in the passenger seat and I can feel jealous. Or I can play a mediocre show on Saturday with my band and I can feel embarrassed. Or I can come back next time and just kill it and then I can feel proud. These are all emotions. We experience them. There's nothing wrong with them. But they are not the same as feeling. Well, what's feeling? Feeling are affective states which can be experienced in one place and one place only, and that is in art. And it's one of the things, at least as far as Eliot's concerned, that makes us human. I've seen dogs get jealous. You've all seen your cat get pissed off for one reason or another. I've actually seen a dog get embarrassed. It was barking at me from the top of a roof and got so excited it fell off the roof. And fortunately, it was only like one floor and it was fine. But, it scampered off with its tail between its legs. It was an embarrassed dog. So, animals have emotions, but animals don't have feelings. You can, put food in front of your dog or you could take it away and you can elicit an emotion from your dog, but no dog is going to sit there and read poetry and be moved by it. No dog, no cat, no bird is going to get excited by listening to a violin sonata or a guitar solo. Feeling is a special category of affective state which is available only to persons, only to humans, and it's only available in art. So what Eliot is saying is, in a way, art becomes a place where we check in with what makes us human. We will manifest our degree of humanity and our degree of civilization, if you will, from our ability to listen to music, read poetry, look at paintings, and not simply either be thrilled or terrified or enamored of them, but to be stirred by them in a way which transcends their content. Because it's the paint strokes, the sculptor's touch, working with the materials. This elicits in us feeling. And this is what we want from art. Sure, there'll be emotion in there, but emotion must be transcended so that we can exist in a state of exalted consciousness and have access to aesthetic feeling.